the first time Lillian Thorne truly understood her place in the Duke of Blackwood's life. She was standing in a ballroom filled with 200 of London's finest, and she had never felt more invisible. The chandeliers glittered overhead, the orchestra swelled with a waltz, and her husband had not looked at her in 3 hours. He danced with Lady Cecilia Montfort for the second time that evening, his gloved hand resting at the young widow's waist with an ease that made the matrons behind their fans murmur, and the gentlemen exchange knowing glances. Lillian stood near a marble pillar, her champagne untouched, her silk gown the exact shade of pale rose that her mother had once told her would make her look like a watercolor painting. It did not matter. The Duke's eyes, the color of winter slate, passed over her as though she were part of the wallpaper. She heard the whispers, she always heard them. Poor Duchess, not even 2 years married, and he still treats her like a stranger. You know the story, don't you? The Thornes are the reason his mother perished in that fire. He only wed her because the old dukes will demanded it. Such a shame. She seems gentle enough, but hatred like that does not fade with a ring. Lillian's fingers tightened on the stem of her glass. She had known, of course, that the marriage was born of obligation. On their wedding night, Adrian Blackwood had stood across the bedchamber, still in his dark coat, his face cut from stone, and he had spoken words that had never stopped echoing in her heart. This union satisfies my father's final wish. I will give you my name and my protection, but do not expect tenderness. Do not expect love. Your family's name is a stain I cannot wash from my memory. She had nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had believed foolishly that time might soften him, that kindness might win him, that if she were patient enough, gracious enough, invisible enough, he would eventually see her as something other than a duty. 2 years had passed, he had not. That night when the ball ended and the carriage carried them back to Blackwood Manor in crushing silence, Lillian sat across from her husband and watched the shadows carve hollows beneath his cheekbones. He did not speak. He never did. She had learned to read his silences, the cold silence of her presence, the distant silence of his grief, the irritable silence when she attempted conversation. Tonight, it was the silence of complete indifference. And something inside her, something that had been quietly cracking for months, finally began to splinter. She did not cry in the carriage. She had trained herself not to cry where anyone could see. But later, alone in her candle-lit chamber, she pressed her palm against the ache in her chest and let the tears fall silently into her pillow. She wept not for the man he was, but for the woman she had become, a ghost in her own marriage, a placeholder in a grand estate that would never feel like home. The following morning brought rain, a steady gray sheet that blurred the gardens and turned the moors beyond into a wash of silver mist. Lillian, red-eyed and hollow, knew she could not spend another day confined to the embroidery frame in her sitting room, waiting for a husband who never came. So she pulled on a plain walking dress, took a heavy shawl, and slipped out into the damp stillness of the neglected East Garden. She had discovered it by accident months ago, a walled enclosure overgrown with wild roses and tangled ivy, its fountain long dry, its greenhouse a skeleton of rusted iron and cracked glass. The gardeners avoided it, muttering about the late Duchess who had loved this garden before the fire took her. Lillian understood why Adrian had let it fall into ruin. Every stone here held a memory of his mother. But to Lillian, it felt like the only place on the estate where she could breathe, without being weighed down by the invisible stones of his resentment. She was kneeling by a struggling rosebush, her fingers black with soil, when she heard the servants before she saw them. 2 maids had paused just beyond the ivy-covered wall, their voices carrying clearly through the damp air. His Grace's valet says he still keeps her miniature in his desk drawer. The mother, I mean, not the Duchess. Of course not the Duchess. Everyone knows he blames her family for the fire. My mum worked in the Thornes' London house years ago, said it was their warehouse where the blaze started. It jumped to the Blackwood townhouse next door. The old Duke's wife was trapped. And the Duchess, our Duchess, her father owned that warehouse. The very one, died in the fire himself, they say, but his grace lost his mother and he's never forgiven it. Why do you think he's so cold to her? She's a walking reminder. Lillian's hand stilled in the earth. The rain dripped from the brim of her bonnet, cold against her neck. She had known there was bitterness. She had not known it was carved from tragedy so deep it had calcified into hatred. Her father had died when she was a child. She had been told it was an accident, a terrible fire in a London warehouse. No one had ever whispered that the flames had reached a neighboring home. No one had ever told her that the Blackwood family lost their beloved Duchess that same night. Her father's memory to Adrian was not a tragedy, it was a crime. She sat back on her heels, her heart a dull, heavy weight. If she had hoped for even a sliver of affection, that hope now felt like a cruelty she had done to herself. He would never forgive her for blood she could not change, and a fire she had been too young to even remember. Something shifted in her then. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. She was tired of earning a love that had been refused before she was ever born. That afternoon, Lillian went not to her sitting room but to the manor's vast, dusty library. She told herself she needed answers. She found them tucked behind a row of leather-bound ledgers in the oldest section of the room. A bundle of letters, tied with faded black ribbon, hidden so carefully that only someone searching with desperate fingers would ever discover them. The handwriting on the top letter was her father's. She read them all, seated on the cold floor as the gray light faded. Her father, Edmund Thorne, had not been a careless merchant who let his warehouse burn through negligence. He had been a friend. The letters revealed a quiet, years-long correspondence between him and the late Duchess of Blackwood, a woman he had admired and respected. On the night of the fire, Edmund had been at the warehouse reviewing ledgers when he smelled smoke. Instead of fleeing, he had rushed next door to the Blackwood townhouse, knowing the family was in residence. He had pulled the young Duke, Adrian, then only 10 years old, from a smoke-filled hallway. Then he had gone back inside for the Duchess. Neither of them came out alive. Lillian pressed her fist to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her father had died a hero, not a villain. He had saved Adrian's life. And Adrian, fed lies by a bitter grandfather who could not bear the senselessness of the loss, had grown up believing the Thornes were murderers. She sat amidst the scattered letters, her whole body trembling. She could bring these to him. She could prove her father's innocence, prove that the wall between them was built on a foundation of ash and falsehood. But as she imagined his face, the hard set of his jaw, the cold disbelief in his eyes, she knew the truth would not set her free. He would accuse her of forgery. He would see it as a desperate ploy for his affection. He would hate her more. Or worse, he would believe her, and the entire architecture of his grief and anger would collapse around him. She would be the one who took even his righteous fury away, leaving him with nothing but decades of misdirected hatred and guilt so heavy it might drown him. She could not do that to him. She loved him. Despite everything, she loved him. And love, she realized with a piercing clarity, was not about winning. It was sometimes about losing with grace. She tied the letters back with trembling fingers and hid them in the false bottom of an old trunk in her bedchamber. Then she washed her hands, smoothed her hair, and walked downstairs to preside over a dinner her husband would not attend. She did not cry. She had stopped crying. Instead, she began to let go. The change was so gradual that Adrian Blackwood almost missed it entirely. For 2 years, his wife had been a constant, quiet presence at the edge of his life, always there when he entered a room, her eyes hopeful, a gentle question on her lips that he never allowed her to voice. She had arranged his favorite meals, inquired after his headaches, left fresh flowers in his study. He had resented every small kindness, seeing them as attempts to erode the wall he had so carefully constructed. But one morning he walked into the breakfast room to find only his plate and the newspaper. Lillian was not there. He waited, listening for her footsteps, but the corridor remained silent. When he asked the butler, the man said, "Her Grace took a tray in the East Garden, Your Grace. She has been spending her mornings there." The Duke said nothing. He drank his coffee and felt a strange, hollow irritation he could not name. It did not matter if she was absent. It was what he wanted. Except that over the following weeks, her absence spread like a quiet tide. She no longer appeared at dinner, sending word that she would eat simply in her sitting room. She stopped leaving flowers in his study. She stopped asking if he had slept well. She stopped looking at him with that unbearable, hopeful softness. Instead, she began to look content. He would glimpse her from his study window, walking across the lawn with an old straw hat shading her face, her hands full of freshly cut greenery. Sometimes she laughed with the elderly gardener, a man named Finch who had worked the Blackwood grounds for 40 years. Other times she bent over a planting bed with a concentration that seemed to shut out the entire world. Adrian told himself he was relieved. The weight of her expectation had been a burden he had not asked for, but the relief tasted strangely like disappointment, and he found himself pausing at windows more often than he ever had before. The first true crack in his indifference came on a golden afternoon in early autumn. He had been reviewing estate accounts in his study when a sound drifted through the open window, a sound he had not heard in this house since his mother died. Laughter. Not polite, restrained laughter, but the bright, unguarded laugh of genuine joy. He rose and looked out. In the east garden, the one his mother had loved, the one he had let go to ruin, his wife stood beside a tall, sandy-haired gentleman he did not recognize. The man was holding up a potted plant with an expression of exaggerated seriousness, and Lillian was laughing with her whole body, one hand resting lightly on the man's sleeve. The sunlight caught the curve of her smile, the easy warmth in her eyes, and Adrian felt something hot and unfamiliar twist in his chest. He summoned his steward. "Who is that man?" "Mr. Edmund Fletcher, Your Grace, a botanist and a distant cousin to Her Grace. He arrived this morning with an invitation from the Dowager." Adrian's jaw tightened. He had not known his grandmother had extended any invitation. He had not known Lillian had a cousin so close, so familiar. The man's name, Edmund, struck a chord he did not want to examine. Her father's name. He watched them for another long minute, watched the way Fletcher leaned toward her with the easy confidence of an old friend, watched the way Lillian's face was animated in a way it never was in his presence. Then he turned from the window and closed it with more force than necessary. The sound of her laughter followed him for the rest of the day, a ghost of happiness he had no right to resent, and yet could not seem to escape. That evening, he made a point of attending dinner. Lillian, informed of his presence at the last moment, entered the dining room with a serene expression that revealed neither pleasure nor surprise. She wore a gown of soft blue that made her look like a piece of the sky, and she took her seat at the far end of the long table without a single glance in his direction. "I trust your day was pleasant," he said, the words stiff and unfamiliar. He had not made small talk with his wife in months, perhaps years. "Quite pleasant, thank you." She unfolded her napkin. "Mr. Fletcher and I have been cataloging the surviving plants in the East Garden. He believes the old roses can be revived." "The East Garden has been closed for years." "Yes, I have opened it." Her voice was calm, entirely without defiance, but the statement hung in the air like a declaration of independence. Adrian's fingers tightened on his wine glass. "That garden was my mother." "I know." For the first time she met his eyes. There was no challenge there, only a quiet understanding that unsettled him deeply. "That is why it deserves to live again." He had no response. The meal continued in near silence, but it was a different silence now. No longer the heavy weight of her unspoken pleas, but a clear, cool distance that felt like a door quietly closing. When she excused herself early, he sat alone in the candlelight and realized, with a jolt that felt almost physical, that she had not once asked him about his day. She had not once looked at him with hope. Something had shifted, and for the first time in 2 years, Adrian Blackwood felt the sharp, unfamiliar sting of being unseen. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of everything he thought he knew. Edmund Fletcher stayed on at the Dowager's invitation, his laugh echoing through the gardens, his presence a constant reminder of a world from which Adrian had excluded himself. Lillian spent hours with him, their heads bent together over botanical sketches, their conversations peppered with Latin plant names and shared memories of childhood summers. Adrian found himself inventing reasons to walk past the greenhouse, a structure she had begun to restore with her own hands, and each time he saw her smile at Fletcher, the hot twist in his chest grew sharper. One afternoon, he could no longer contain it. He intercepted her in the corridor as she carried a tray of seedlings toward the garden. She stopped, looking up at him with a polite, distant expression that made his skin feel too tight. "You spend a great deal of time with Mr. Fletcher," he said. "He is a dear friend, the only one I have here." The words were not an accusation, but they landed like one. Adrian's jaw flexed. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood. You have a household, a position." "I have a title," she corrected quietly. "A title is not a companion." She stepped around him, her shoulders straight, and he was left staring at the empty space where she had been. That night, Lady Cecilia Montfort arrived for a dinner party the Dowager had arranged, a fact Adrian had forgotten entirely. He found himself seated beside the beautiful widow, her perfume cloying, her laugh too eager, while his wife sat at the opposite end of the table beside Edmund Fletcher. Lillian did not look his way. She did not seem to care that Lady Cecilia's hand brushed his sleeve, that her voice dripped with practiced intimacy. Instead, she spoke softly with Fletcher, and once, when the man leaned close to tell her something private, she smiled with a tenderness that made Adrian's blood run cold. He realized with a clarity that bordered on pain that he was jealous, not of Fletcher's ease or his charm, but of the way Lillian looked at him. She had once looked at Adrian that way. He had crushed that look every single time until it had finally, irrevocably, died. After the guests retired, he found himself standing outside his wife's chamber door. He had not sought her out in her private room since the earliest weeks of their marriage, and even then it had been cold and distant. Tonight, his hand hovered over the wood, and a feeling he could not name, loneliness perhaps or fear, pushed him to knock. Her maid opened the door. A moment later Lillian appeared, her hair loosened for sleep, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked at him without surprise, and that lack of surprise wounded him more than any accusation could have. "Yes, I thought we might speak." She studied him for a long moment, and he saw something flicker in her eyes, something that might have been sadness or pity or simply exhaustion. "It is late, Your Grace. I am tired. Perhaps tomorrow." She was dismissing him, politely, gently, but undeniably. He, the Duke of Blackwood, was being dismissed by his own wife, and the most devastating part was that he deserved it. He nodded stiffly and walked away. Behind him, the door closed with a soft click that sounded, to his ears, like the final note of a song he had refused to learn. Winter crept over Blackwood Manor like a slow, silver frost, and with it came a new kind of stillness. Lillian had stopped hopping, and in the absence of hope, she had found a quiet, resilient peace. The greenhouse was her sanctuary now. She had repaired the broken panes herself, her fingers calloused for the first time in her life. She had coaxed the old roses back from near death, and Finch the gardener had become her unlikely confidant. She taught a young kitchen boy his letters by candlelight, and she began writing a small botanical journal, recording the plants she revived. She was, for the first time since her wedding day, building a life that did not orbit around her husband's cold center. Adrian watched it all with a growing, desperate confusion. He saw the way the servants had begun to smile when she passed, a genuine warmth they had never shown him. He saw the way Fletcher's visits grew longer, the way the man's voice softened when he spoke her name. He saw the garden blooming even in the thin winter light, stubborn and alive, a testament to her care. And he saw the unsent letter. It happened by accident. He had gone to her sitting room to retrieve a book he had lent her months ago, a volume of poetry she had once asked to borrow, back when she still asked him for things. The book was not on the shelf. He opened the drawer of her writing desk, searching for it, and his fingers brushed a folded piece of paper, its edges worn as though it had been handled many times. He should not have read it. He knew that even as he unfolded it. But the first words, written in her careful, elegant hand, seized him and would not let go. My dearest Adrian, I do not know if I will ever give you this letter. Perhaps I will burn it. Perhaps I will keep it hidden until I am old and this foolish, stubborn love has finally left me in peace. But tonight I cannot sleep, and I need to say the words at least once, even if only to the silence. I love you. I have loved you since the first week of our marriage, when you walked me through the portrait gallery and told me the name of every ancestor, and your voice was not cold but weary, and I hoped, that underneath your distance there was a heart still capable of feeling. I have loved you through every cold breakfast, every turned shoulder, every evening you looked past me as though I were made of air. I know you blame my family for a pain I cannot heal. I know you did not choose me, but I chose you. I chose you every day for 2 years, and I would have kept choosing you until I had no more days left. But I am so tired, Adrian. I am tired of loving a man who will never love me back. I am tired of being a ghost in your house. So I am writing this letter to say goodbye to the hope I have carried. I will not burden you with it any longer. I will set it down, and I will walk away, and you will never know how much you were loved by the woman you refused to see. If you ever find this, know that I forgave you long before you thought to ask. The letter was unsigned and undated, but the paper was soft from the press of her fingers, and Adrian knew, with a certainty that shattered something inside him, that she had carried this love alone in silence until it had finally broken her. He refolded the letter with trembling hands and placed it back exactly as he had found it. Then he walked to the window and stood there for a very long time, staring at the gray winter sky, his chest a hollow cavern of regret. That night he could not sleep. He wandered the dark halls like a man searching for something he had lost and could not name. He found himself in the east wing, outside the trunk where she had hidden her father's letters. He did not know what drew him to it. Perhaps it was the restlessness of a guilty conscience. Perhaps it was fate. The false bottom of the trunk gave way under his searching fingers, and he found the bundle of letters tied with faded black ribbon. He read them by the light of a single candle, his breath coming faster with every word. He read the account of his mother's friendship with Edmund Thorne. He read the eyewitness testimony, copied in a servant's hand, describing how Thorne had carried the young duke from the flames before returning for the Duchess. He read the truth, the shattering, undeniable truth, that the man he had hated all his life had died saving his. The candle burned low. Dawn crept gray and cold through the windows. Adrian sat amidst the scattered letters, his face wet with tears he had not shed since he was 10 years old. His entire life, his entire marriage had been built on a lie. And the woman who had known the truth, who could have used it to demand his gratitude or his love, had chosen instead to bury it, to protect him from the weight of his own misplaced hatred. He thought of her quiet dignity, her silent suffering, her unsent letter. He thought of the way she had looked at him across the dinner table with calm, distant eyes, and he understood finally that he had not just lost her affection. He had destroyed it, and he had only himself to blame. He rose on unsteady legs and went to find her. The house was just beginning to stir, maids lighting fires, footmen drawing curtains. He stopped a housemaid. "Where is her grace?" The girl curtsied, looking startled by the urgency in his voice. "She has gone to the village, your grace. Her maid said she was taking the morning coach to Bath. She left a letter for you in the entrance hall." The fear that seized Adrian's heart was unlike anything he had ever felt. He did not walk to the entrance hall. He ran. The letter lay on the silver tray, her handwriting steady and serene. He tore it open with shaking hands. "Adrian, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I have released you from a marriage that should never have been. You are free to find happiness with someone you can love without the shadow of the past between you. I ask only that you do not think too harshly of me. I tried for a long time to be what you needed. I simply was not enough. Take care of the roses. Lillian. The words blurred before his eyes. She was gone. She was leaving him, and she was doing it with the same quiet grace she had shown every single day of their marriage, and he could not bear it. He shouted for his horse. He did not bother with a coat. He rode through the cold morning mist as though the hounds of hell were at his heels, the letter clutched in his fist, her name a desperate prayer on his lips. He caught up with the coach on the edge of the moor, just before the turn that would take the road to Bath. The driver pulled up at his frantic shouting, and Adrian flung himself from the saddle and wrenched the carriage door open before the wheels had fully stopped. Lillian sat inside, wrapped in a gray traveling cloak, her eyes wide with shock. She had been crying. He could see the tracks of tears on her cheeks, and the sight broke what was left of his pride into pieces. Adrian, what? He climbed into the carriage, dropping to his knees before her on the narrow floor. He took her hands, and his voice was raw, cracked, nothing like the cold duke she had married. Don't go, Lillian, please don't leave me. She stared at him, uncomprehending. You don't want me here, you never have. I was wrong. The words tumbled out of him, unpolished and desperate. I was blind and proud and so terribly wrong. I found the letters. I know what your father did. I know he saved my life. I know I have been hatting a ghost while you carried the truth alone to spare me pain. His voice broke. I read your letter, the one you never sent. I know you loved me, and I know I destroyed that love with my own hands. She was trembling now, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Why are you here, Adrian? Because I am in love with you. He said it like a confession, like a man laying down a weapon he had carried for too long. I think I have loved you for a long time, but I was too afraid to feel it, too stubborn to admit that the woman I swore to keep at a distance had become the very center of my world. You are not a ghost in my house. You are its heart. You are my heart. And I cannot lose you now, not when I have only just begun to understand what I have. He pressed her hands to his chest over the frantic beat of his heart. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I have been a cold husband, a bitter man, a fool. But if you can find it in yourself to give me a chance, a real chance, I will spend every day of my life proving that your love was not wasted. I will learn to be the man you deserve. I will tear down every wall I built. I will love you openly, fiercely, for as long as I have breath. Silence filled the carriage, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind outside. Lillian looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her eyes. Not the old, desperate hope he had crushed so many times, but something quieter. Something that might have been the first fragile bloom of trust. You hurt me, she whispered. For 2 years you made me feel invisible. I know. His voice was thick with tears. And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you will let me. She was still for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached up and touched his face, the first time she had touched him in months. Her fingers were cold from the journey, but her touch was gentle, and Adrian closed his eyes as if it were a benediction. I never stopped loving you, she said softly, even when I tried, even when I wrote that letter to say goodbye. I don't know if I can trust this yet. I don't know if I can open my heart again without fear, but I know I don't want to leave. A sob tore from his chest, half relief, half anguish. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and she did not resist. She held him back, her fingers clutching the fabric of his coat as though he might disappear if she let go. Come home, he whispered against her temple. Please come home. She nodded, and the carriage turned back toward Blackwood Manor. The journey was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the cold silence of strangers, but the breathless stillness of two people standing on the edge of something new. Adrian kept her hand in his the entire way, his thumb tracing small circles on her knuckles, as if he was memorizing the feel of her. When the manor came into view through the lifting mist, He felt her squeeze his hand, and something tight and painful in his chest finally began to loosen. Spring came gently to Blackwood that year. The East Garden bloomed with a wild, joyful abandon that would have made the late Duchess proud. Lillian and Adrian spent hours there together, his hand at the small of her back, her laughter finally free. He learned the names of every plant she had revived. She learned that beneath his cold exterior, there was a man who could recite poetry from memory, who blushed when she teased him, who would carry her across muddy paths rather than let her soil her slippers. He told her, one evening as they watched the sunset paint the greenhouse in shades of rose and gold, that he had never believed in second chances until she gave him one. She rested her head against his shoulder and told him that some gardens only grow after the hardest winter. And when their son was born the following year, they named him Edmund, after the grandfather who had died a hero and the love that had, against all odds, risen from the ashes.